My name is Elizabeth Newberry, and I'm here at the Wilson Center with the Science and Technology Innovation Program. And with my colleagues at the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of the Big Data and Resilience Storybook. We are so pleased to be hosting today's event with a number of stellar organizations, many of which are represented on this very panel. It's a very full panel, so we're going to move quickly through the presentations. And hopefully at the end of the time, we'll have enough time for a couple of questions. In the meantime, one of the things I'd like to encourage you to do is that, first of all, this event is being live streamed, so tell all your friends. And the other thing is, if you are on the Twitterverse and would like to tweet at the event, the 3 programs that I have to tell you about are at New Security Beat, like you beat a drum, and then at Wilson, like Woodrow Wilson, STIP, so that's Wilson STIP, and then IISD_news. So those are the 3 programs that if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to tweet at us and we'll try to be as responsive as possible. So the other thing I wanted to make sure to address is a quick word on where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is celebrating its 50th anniversary as the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the first president to have been awarded or earned a PhD. So recognizing his scholarship, Congress honored him with a think tank in 1968. We strive to bridge the worlds of scholarship, policy, and practice, and I think today's event is an excellent example of how we can do just that. The panel will be moderated by Ann Hamill. Ann is the director of the Resilience at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where she focuses on understanding how better environmental management can build resilience to climate stress and contribute to peace building. She's a longtime friend of the Wilson Center, and we're delighted to welcome her back. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Ann. So thank you all so much for coming.
Great, thank you for that. And good morning to everybody, and welcome to this launch of the Big Data for Resilience Storybook. As was just said, my name is Ann Hamill. I'm the director of the Resilience Program at IISD, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning to open and moderate what we're looking forward as a series of very interesting and diverse presentations, and then hopefully some conversation afterwards. Before going on, I also want to really thank our friends here at the Wilson Center for providing us with such a great space to have this event. And then also thank all of you who are with us in person and hopefully in a few minutes online to learn more about this issue around the issues around big data and resilience, and then hopefully participate in what we're seeing as the beginning of a broader discussion on these issues. ISD's own resilience program has started exploring this issue of big data probably over the last year or so. And, you know, it was really in response to not only sort of a broader recognition that obviously big data is playing a bigger role in our everyday lives, but we're also seeing that it's playing a bigger role in humanitarian and development programming as well. And so this really prompted us to think at ISD, what does this mean specifically for our own resilience programming, our own resilience thinking? We do a number of initiatives. We host global secretariats. We undertake research projects on things ranging from climate change adaptation to the links between environment, conflict, and peace building. We've been exploring food systems. And what's the role of big data in exploring these under this umbrella concept and approach of resilience? And so with some initial support from IISD's own innovation fund, we were given an opportunity to start exploring this issue. And to help us really start thinking about this issue, we reached out to a number of organizations that we had already seen were also asking similar questions, who'd already started using big data and how they do their own work. And this afforded us an opportunity to query the risks, the opportunities, the limitations of big data and resilience building. And so what you're going to see here today is not only a presentation on some of these stories and experiences, but a product, the fruit of this sort of initial inquiry from ISD, the storybook on big data for resilience. And so that's what this morning's event is going to be about. And before moving on, though, and before we delve into some of these stories, I do want to give a special thanks to our collaborators in this endeavor. And specifically, those are the United Nations Global Pulse, the Pulse Lab in Jakarta, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Conservation International, the Netherlands Red Cross 510 Data Initiative, Mercy Corps, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research's Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and then, of course, ISD's, our own colleagues at our Experimental Lakes area. And so with that, let's get to some of the stories that are presented in the storybook. And to kick things off, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Angelica Ospina, who will present the storybook and specifically its analytical framework, the Big Data for Resilience Kaleidoscope. Angelica is a senior researcher with the Resilience program at IISD, and she's also the lead for the Big Data for Resilience initiative. She has over 10 years of experience on resilience programming and research, including a PhD on climate change resilience and the role of information and communication technologies in agricultural livelihoods. She's also been working for and with a number of development organizations to operationalize this concept and this approach of resilience in their own programming. So with that, I'll hand over to Angelica to get things started.
So thank you so much, Anne, for your introduction, and a very warm welcome to all of you here today, and very soon to the people that are going to be joining us through webcast. And a very special thank you again to our colleagues from the Wilson Center to make this meeting a reality. So this is a very special moment from me, both professionally and personally, because this Big Data for Resilience initiative really has been a very important part of my life and my work during the last year almost. Those that know me know that I have a very unique relationship with new technologies. I'm part of that odd sandwich generation that grew up and went to school and even went to university without the internet. So we are the proper pre-internet geeks. And that is to say that technologies are not something that comes easily or naturally to me. And it's certainly not something that I take for granted. But nevertheless, I have a very profound awareness and a very profound passion about the role that information and communication technologies can play and are playing in development and also in processes of resilience building in vulnerable communities. So that curiosity about technologies and that passion about technologies is actually what brought together 7 different organizations. Most of them are here today, and all of us work together producing the Big Data for Resilience storybook that we're here to launch. I want to mention that the storybook is not only a compilation of 8 different experiences of organizations working at the intersection of big data and resilience. It's also the result of the work of a team of more than 30 people in the Netherlands, Mongolia, Tanzania, Colombia, Indonesia, the US, and Canada that came together over the last 7 months to make this a reality. As Anne mentioned at the beginning of her remarks, this initiative, the Big Data for Resilience initiative, is funded and is supported by IISD's Innovation Award. That means that we really needed to make sure that it was something really innovative and really different and contributed to the dialogue about big data and resilience. So we did that in 2 ways. The first, we brought together a new group of partners to think about the links that exist between big data and processes of resilience building, more concretely on the way in which big data is contributing and can contribute to the ability of vulnerable systems, like communities in developing countries, to better cope with, adapt, and potentially transform to the effects of shocks and stressors. We'll hear more about those different experiences through our presenters, but I wanted to give you a short overview. Jeff, can you help me flip through the storybook? I wanted to give you a kind of quick overview of what the storybook looks like. All the stories in the storybook, the 8 different stories or experiences, follow more or less the same structure. So all the cases tell us about the context within which the project or initiative is being implemented. It tells us a bit the characteristics of the big data that project or initiative is using. It tells us a bit about the resilience approach of each project and initiative. It talks about the challenges and the enablers within that project in order to ensure that big data contributes to resilience. And all of the stories also end with a section of recommendations and next steps. And the reason for that is that we wanted to ensure that the storybook was really practical and that gave information and useful tips for decision makers and resilience practitioners in developing countries. So I will invite you to browse the storybook, to kind of enjoy it. It's very visual, and I think I will leave it at that for now. The second way in which we strive to be innovative through this award was through the creation of a new analytical model to explore the linkages between big data and resilience. And this is the Big Data for Resilience Kaleidoscope. Sorry, I'll just move a little bit the microphone so I can show you what the kaleidoscope is about. So before you think, oh God, not another conceptual framework, there's so many out there, this is really, really different. So the Big Data for Resilience Kaleidoscope allows decision makers and practitioners to have an overview, a snapshot of the different factors that play a role in the transition or the linkages between big data and processes of resilience building. The kaleidoscope is composed by 6 different layers that you'll see here. The resilience score, and I'll go through each of them really quickly. So the resilience score refers to the 3 main capacities of resilience systems: the capacity to adapt, to cope, and to transform. The Kaleidoscope online offers you definitions and examples of each of these concepts by clicking on them. The second layer is the layer of the resilience foundations that remind us of the key questions that we need to take into account when we implement and design resilience projects. And those are the questions: resilience for what, resilience how, resilience of whom, resilience where, and resilience to what. And again, all the explanations and the examples are available when you click on them. The third layer of the kaleidoscope refers to the big data basics, and these are the characteristics of big data sets. So, sorry. Data basics and resilience attributes. Well, will come in a second. The next layer are the resilience attributes of a system. So attributes such as self-organization, learning, scale, redundancy, equity, and others. The next layer is what we call the Big Data for Resilience data impact chain, which is a very important layer of the conceptual model because it reminds us that the availability of data is not enough, that we need to make sure that we are ready, we're prepared, we have the capacity and the resources to actually make that data accessible, that we have the capacity to assess that data, implement it or integrate it as part of decision making, and actually make sure that that data, that information is being acted upon, so it can really contribute to the achievement of development outcomes. The last layer of the kaleidoscope refers to the enabling factors that play a role in that conversion process between simply data and the achievement of development outcomes. Something that is very important in this new conceptual model is that the user can actually randomize the connections, can play with different interactions and feedbacks between these different conceptual components, and the user can actually zoom in into and dig deeper, take a deeper dive into some of the analytical and practical implications of those connections. The last thing that I will say about the Kaleidoscope at this point is that as a special kind of added bonus to our collaboration with these 7 different organizations, we actually created a Kaleidoscope for each of our cases. So each of the cases that you will find in the Big Data for Resilience storybook is also portrayed as part of this Kaleidoscope. So each of the organizations has a distinctive kaleidoscope. For example, if we go to the kaleidoscope of the case for Conservation International, by clicking on the different components, you'll be able to learn more about how Conservation International, through its Resilience Atlas, is tackling those different components of resilience and big data. So again, I will invite you to explore the kaleidoscope, to play with it, to explore the different features. It is, again, a very interactive and cool tool. And part of the thinking behind is that conceptual models and analytical models should not and don't need to be static and boring, but we can really tackle these issues, these conceptual linkages, in a robust, systematic way, but also opening room for more interactive tools and just, appeal to the creativity and ingenuity of practitioners and users. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our collaborators at Machine in Ottawa, who step up to the challenge of creating this very novel model online, which you will be also able to access, of course, through your mobile phone. And I look forward to sharing a bit more of some of the findings and the future areas for research that we identify through the analysis of all the different cases during the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Angelica, for providing some further context to some of the stories we're going to be hearing about this morning, but also giving us a bit of structure, a colorful and dynamic structure also for thinking about more systematically the different elements of these stories. So getting to some of the case studies, we're going to kick things off with my colleague Jeff Gunn from IISD's Experimental Lakes area. Jeff is a geographer at ISD, where his research focuses on geospatial analysis, data science, and ecosystem monitoring within the context of freshwater issues. He draws on a decade of computational and field techniques in Earth observation and geographic information science, including field research expeditions to the Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic. And so with that, I'll pass it over to you, Jeff.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. So this was an interesting opportunity when Angelica approached me to work together for our ISD Innovation Fund because, as Anne mentioned, I've been working in Earth observation and remote sensing for about 10 years. And in that fairly short career, I've seen the change in big data. My very first job was taking DVDs, loading them onto the computer, and processing them. Now I can do that 2-hour task in a second. So we're seeing it change so quickly, and in science, it's really happening fast. When you merge that over to resilience, and complexity multiplies. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ELA, very quick introduction, then talk to you about how big data is helping us improve resilience. So if you haven't heard of it, ELA is, I said Canada's freshwater laboratory, but it's really the world's freshwater laboratory. We're a network of 58 pristine lakes in northwestern Ontario and the Boreal Shield up there, just north of Minnesota, designated for scientific research, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. It's the only place in the world where we have the rain under supervision to manipulate lakes and to understand how human impacts really affect things in a laboratory sort of mode, but in an environmental and whole ecosystem setting. So that's merging lakes that are manipulated as well as reference lakes, kind of keeping it really scientifically robust. It brings together these freshwater sciences, ecology, limnology, physical sciences, atmospheric sciences, all together in one spot. We are collecting data constantly, we're building it really quickly, and then we're also bridging science and policy because it was originally founded as a government research institution, so policy was always there as the guiding light. About 4 years ago, ISD took over and took over operations of the ELA and kind of has taken it to a more charitable model, which has also expanded our view towards communities, local communities, and global communities. So being a scientific research institution like us, we collect a lot of data. We want to monitor everything. Every little parameter we can find, we have a monitoring system for that. And because we're good scientists, we keep that data. And also because we're scientists, we don't necessarily keep it in a great way, or we haven't in the past. We're looking to change that. The data is coming in really quickly for lakes and atmospheric data. It's coming in on second or 10-minute scales. Some of it's coming in more slowly when you're looking at fish populations. You're thinking annually. Hundreds of attributes. I manage the ELA database, and it's large and complex. It's high in veracity because it's got the peer review aspect to it. Almost all the data has been published in academic publications. It also has a scientific review committee, and we make sure that it meets all the needs of users. It was established as a living laboratory, but it's become now more of an observatory as well, because not only are we seeing changes that we do when we manipulate lakes, we also see the changes the whole world is experiencing under climate change. Being an observatory so remotely located, we only see the things that happen at that global scale. In the 70s and 80s, we could see acid rain happening despite there being very little industrial activity for 500 kilometers or more. But how does it build resilience? And how do scientific activities not just become the race to publish more papers and get yourself in high-impact journals? We want to work with communities. So when we examine this for the Big Data for Resilience Storybook, we looked at how we help build adaptive capacities. What you see here on your right is one of the more famous photographs in the field of limnology or lake science. It was when a lake was partitioned and split right in half. One side, the bottom you see, has been had phosphorus and nitrogen added. The top side was left normal. It's a nice clear blue lake in the forest. That really showed clearly to policymakers around the world, this is a problem that we need to deal with, and this has helped some of the works going on in the Great Lakes. We also look at local communities, and we started to build the relationships in a spirit of reconciliation in Canada with our Treaty 3 neighbors, to look at how the needs of people in these remote communities in Canada aren't being met, and how we could help find the pathways and help build that resilience within the community to meet the challenges of either industrial development or climate change. So we do this by really meeting. We've been taking our science outside. We step out of the lab, even if you conceive of the lab as being the outdoors. We want to take it to more people. We want to bring it outside. We want to meet face to face with other users. So within the framework of the BD4R model that Angelica developed, we think about our data access. We are within the world of ecology, where there is a great paper that references how ecologists have a poor record of data curation. Really great at collecting data, really great at analyzing it, but then what? What happens after the paper's published? We're looking at that right now and trying to modernize ourselves and participate in this more global view of science. We want to make our data more open and accessible, and in doing so, build its resilience. The more eyes looks at a data set, the better it becomes. We have the data assessment pretty well. We have it peer reviewed, we have it looked at, we have QA/QC processes. But then how do we apply it beyond just that research? We want to make sure that this data helps inform people, and because it's more frequently collected nowadays, and because we're more networked in the Internet of Things and whatnot like that, that it becomes useful quicker, and it shortens that pathway from science to policy. And then making those actions, making sure those policies are effective and viable and available to people who need them. Right now, we're also working with great collaborators in commercial industries, looking at how certain additions of, say, spills or remediation options, how could they be done the most effectively and best outcomes for ecology. So within the BD4R storybook, we looked at how ISD ELA's work enables and challenges this big data for resilience. We bring to this table our reputation and credibility. We have a 50-year record of producing some of the best lake science on Earth. We have a strong emphasis on experimentation. We don't approach things with an output in mind. We think about how this is happening, what's the system doing, how is it responding, how is it recovering. We also want to be more responsive to local communities and make sure that this is a priority going forward, and that we look at ELA from multiple scales? How can we help the people right next door? How can we help people around the world meet these challenges of the 21st century? We're challenged by our data complexity. It's just so difficult, so variable, and so complex. I'll take us to the lessons. Our whole ecosystem approach isolates stressors. It helps us find those single pieces, the single threads that will help us make that pathway to a more resilient future. We want to meet that balance between openness and quality. Is the data being used appropriately? We also want to transition, we're understanding this transition that other institutions may be going through if they were traditionally a government institution, then moving to a different model. That's an interesting framework I won't get into here, but we're always happy to talk about. Finally, we represent, and this is by no means just us, but a look at more holistic and integrated science, looking at things not in isolation, but expanding it to whole ecosystems, regions, and the whole world. So with that, I'll pass it along, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. And it was interesting for me to hear that this sort of resilience framing, we're talking about resilience of ecosystems, of communities. We even talked about the resilience of a data set as well. And so it's being applied in a number of different ways in this one particular case study. So moving along, I'm happy to introduce Tyler Radford, who is currently serving as the Humanitarian OpenStreetMaps team's executive director. Tyler oversees a team of 79 staff deployed globally and works to engage and coordinate the efforts of thousands of disaster mapping volunteers for projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Prior to joining the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Tyler led the American Red Cross Hurricane Sandy New York Community Disaster Recovery Strategy Development and Implementation, and directed a team of community recovery specialists engaging affected residents and community organizations on the ground. And so with that, he's going to share with us some experiences on their use of big data for resilience building. So I'll hand it over to Tyler.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Anne, and thank you to IISD and the Wilson Center for having us here today. Am I controlling my own slides? Yes. Clicker, thank you. So when we think about big data, I'd like you all to kind of take that term in for a minute and kind of think about what comes to mind. It's often things like satellites or cloud computing or a lot of servers or databases. Did any of you think about this young woman? I'd like to just read you a quote. This young woman's one of our mappers in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And this is just a little snippet from an interview we did with her. So our house was flooded up to the roof and we did not have shelter for 3 days, says Sada, of the deadly floods that affected the Jangwani area of Dar es Salaam in 2011. Over these days, it was difficult for me to go to school and my exercise books were taken by the water. So I'm going to come back to Sada a little bit later. I first wanted to kind of set the context about the type of work we do and the city where we're doing it in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So for those of you who might be familiar with Dar, this is the fastest growing city in Africa, estimated to have 6 million plus people, residents. And it's growing at an extremely rapid rate with something like 6% or close to 6% annual growth. The challenge is that we have roughly 80% of the population living in slums or informal settlements. So these are unplanned areas that are extremely congested and unfortunately also very prone to flooding during the annual rains that affect Dar. So this is what it actually looks like. This is a very common scene that you'll see if you walk through some of the informal settlements during the rainy season, where many thousands of homes are affected with water coming to the homes. And in 2011, what Sada was just talking about, that quote I read a minute ago, approximately 10,000 people were displaced from their homes. So how does this relate to big data? This is just an overview map of Dar es Salaam. If you take out your phone and open up your favorite maps application and sort of zoom into Dar es Salaam and go beyond the sort of big picture view you see here, you're often left with just a big yellow area or big gray area of the map. So these are areas that are highly disaster prone to many types of natural hazards, but there's no good data on them. And so this is the challenge that we're facing. The way we address this challenge is really thinking about how can we work with local residents and students who are interested in improving their neighborhoods and bring them into this effort of helping their city to become more resilient. So we worked with over 300 students at several universities in Dar es Salaam, training them on really basic data collection and mapping tools using the platform OpenStreetMap. And we also provided them with satellite imagery. So this is what you would typically see. This is what a student would see on their laptop, satellite imagery over an area of their city. They actually trace this. So they draw squares around the buildings. They draw lines where the roads are. And this data becomes what we call vector data. That's part of OpenStreetMap. And once you digitize a satellite image in this way, you can then do some really cool analysis on the data. So what you're seeing here is the before and after. So as that, the gray is the before, and as you see that sort of orange area come over the screen, those are all the buildings that were digitized by our 300 student volunteers. This is just one neighborhood in Dar es Salaam, home to roughly 6,500 buildings. And this is just one neighborhood out of close to 100 neighborhoods or wards. So after this process of digitizing data on their laptops, students then headed outdoors to actually collect more detail on things like the drainage network. So looking at places where drains were blocked, identifying the width of drains or the whether there was a culvert that wasn't connected as in part of the system. They used locally produced tools. So these are, if I go back to that slide, you'll see sort of in the background there, they're measuring the depth of the actual drain. And they're using it, doing it using these sort of large, very long rulers that were produced locally. And so this is one of the keys that by using local students' own smartphones, own computers, locally produced tools, the whole effort becomes more sustainable. This is one of the tools they were using on their phone. So it's called Open Map Kit. It allows them to walk up to a building, click on that building, and then record more detail about the building. And as the students worked, certain areas started to get filled in on the map over time. And this is you're seeing kind of one neighborhood here, all the buildings and roads that didn't exist previously on the map getting filled in. And through this process, you can really start to see the incredible complexity of cities and urban environments. Dar es Salaam, we estimate, has close to 1 million buildings. So the students mapped each and every building across the entire city, estimated to be home to close to 6 million people. This is 16,000 kilometers of road across the city. And all of this data is accessible to anyone openly and freely via OpenStreetMap on your phone or on a computer or in printed form. So the next step was, okay, we've created this huge big data set through these micro level edits and contributions. Now, how can we actually use it to affect positive change in Dar es Salaam? And so the next sort of step was working with community members, actually involving them sort of in part of the data collection effort. So they were out there mapping alongside our students, people who were affected by flooding. And then we also helped them to understand how they could use the data. And this involved local community members, government officials, and some of the disaster managers in Dar es Salaam. So one thing I wanted to show you is that here are some of the kind of insights that can be gained from open data sets that are citizen generated. So on the left, you see a map that was created through community meetings. So in those meetings, we have a large scale printed map, and we overlay a transparency on top of that. And then community residents who live in areas that are vulnerable to flooding actually help to kind of trace or draw lines around the homes that they think or they perceive as being vulnerable to flooding. The map on the right, we took a different approach. We said, what if we teach neighbors how to do a really basic survey on their smartphones and go ask other neighbors about what's happening? So the map on the right is showing the areas in red are those kind of hotspots that we found from neighbors asking other neighbors. And you can see there's a little bit of a difference from the result you get when people are working in a group setting to when neighbors are actually asking other neighbors about historical flooding. I think one of the key things is you see a hot spot on the map on the right that didn't show up on the one on the left. And there's an area sort of at the top of the map at the left, which looked like it might have been a big problem. But when we actually sent neighbors out to talk to their neighbors on that street, it actually wasn't a big problem. So I think that the key takeaway here is really helping people to understand how to use data and involving them in the process of collecting that data. And as I mentioned, so understanding areas of risk, understanding hazards through big data is really a first step in translating into action. And so I'll leave you with just one example of how that data is translating to action in Dar es Salaam. So through two programs that are sponsored by the World Bank, one is called Twa Mataro, or Adopt a Drain. So residents are actually using the maps, identifying areas where there's a blocked drain and sort of adopting that drain and being responsible for cleaning it on a periodic basis, which really helps to sort of mitigate the effects of flooding. And then the other program, Zuia Mafuriko, is focused on community-based emergency flood response teams who use the maps that the community has produced and the students have produced to respond to flooding in their neighborhoods. So I'll leave it at that. Look forward to answering questions and talking more with you later. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Tyler. Very different story, very different setting. And so we're going to keep going with these stories. And so our next presenter is Alex Walla, who's a Senior Director of Data Science in the Moore Center for Science. He leads the development of new methods and tools to integrate large interdisciplinary data sets to study interactions among climate, land use, and land cover change and human well-being. His work includes research on the effects of climate variability and change on rural livelihoods, interactions between environmental and social change, and research on tropical forest change. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and thanks also to the microphone's falling down there. To the Wilson Center for having us here today as well, and I look forward to hearing from the remaining collaborators on the panel. I know we're short on time, so I'll get right into it. Should I switch here? No problem. So again, I'm from Conservation International. I'll be talking to you today about a project that was initially funded by the Global Resilience Partnership and with support from the Rockefeller Foundation. And so what I'll be speaking about in a moment is the Resilience Atlas. And so basically the goal of this project was the Rockefeller Foundation came to us and they said, we're a partner in this project, the Global Resilience Partnership, the intention of which is to build resilience broadly defined around the globe. And really, they were interested in how they could use big data to inform their investments globally. So what I'll show you in a minute is the tool that we developed, which is called the Resilience Atlas. When we initially started this project, we actually started working on a series of PDF reports. That was the initial structure of what we were going to work on for Rockefeller. We very quickly realized that with something in this thematic area and where there's this broad range of data available, something that's really an interactive tool that can really leverage the power of big data was going to be much more useful than a series of documents. Again, my name's Alex Walla from Conservation International. I want to acknowledge my colleague Monica Noon as well, who's really been a driving force behind this. And without further ado, many of you, of course, are familiar with this background. But one of the key challenges we were seeking to address here was around food security. So as we know, food security is an ongoing challenge in many regions, particularly in many of the areas where we work at Conservation International, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Recent reports have suggested food production must increase by up to 70% if we're going to meet expected demand in 2050. And of course, this is combined in the background with other challenges like climate change. So we expect the effects of climate change will be particularly impactful in those areas that are already food insecure. And at the same time, of course, there's also challenges like land degradation and degradation of the natural capital that really supports local livelihoods. So the challenge is, how can we, and with the background of all these interacting stressors and shocks, what can data really do to inform what we can do now in order to try and address these challenges? So that's one of the things that we're trying to address with our tool here, the Resilience Atlas. So we know that data is needed. I don't think I need to make that argument to this group here. But the other thing that we've really recognized is that we need the right data and at the right scale. So I think a lot of the work that we focus on in big data traditionally, I don't think so with the group here, but traditionally is more global scale projects, global scale data sets, that if you're talking about something, for example, the example we just saw in DAR, you really need this local scale information if you're going to impact local livelihoods, local policy, and the scales at which decisions are made. So the challenge that we sought to address here was really, how can we use data to drive response? So we saw some slides earlier about some of the challenges that are often focused in big data. For us, volume and variety were key challenges that we saw, particularly when you start to talk about climate data sets or data sets derived from remote sensing. Some of the data we processed for the Resilience Atlas, for example, was 12 terabytes in size, so very large data sets that traditionally, if you're working in, for example, in a single country, in a developing region, there may not be the capacity locally to process those data sets. So that was something we were trying to address, is really build a tool where people may not be experts in remote sensing, may not be experts in cloud computing, could really leverage some of the best available information around resilience. So what I'm showing you here is the Resilience Atlas, the main page. This is live if you go to resilienceatlas.org. And so basically what we sought to do in this tool was to combine some of the best available information around resilience into a single place. So what we've done here is combine data into 3 different thematic categories. You can see here on the left-hand side: livelihoods, production systems, and ecosystems, stressors and shocks, and factors influencing vulnerability. The idea really was to build something where, if I'm, say, at a national level or even at a global scale, for example, the Global Resilience Partnership, to have a tool where you can assess, for example, you may be interested in a single livelihood. For example, focusing on pastoralists, you can draw up a layer, understand where that livelihood strategy predominates, what types of stresses and shocks it may be exposed to, and then most importantly, what are some of the key factors that may affect vulnerability of that system. And then, of course, address the question of, if we're making an investment in an area, what are some of the key leverage points we might focus on in order to build resilience. So this is showing, we've also done some work at a subnational scale as well. This is a slide from some work Monica did in Madagascar. What you see here plotted is tropical cyclone frequency off the coast of Madagascar, overlaid with a population data set. And what this can be useful for is, for example, in Madagascar, Monica led a workshop looking at using big data for the development of national adaptation plans. So really having the data in a single place where you can then try and understand, particularly for us at Conservation International, what's the role that natural ecosystems might play in trying to, for example, reduce the vulnerability to tropical cyclones. Another thing I just want to highlight briefly is the concept of journeys. So this is something we developed in tandem with the Atlas. We quickly realized that although we've tried to make the interface easy to use and accessible to those who may not be experts, it's useful to have sort of a guided pathway through the data. So the idea of the journeys is to build a tool where people can try and understand how they might use the data around a particular problem. So for example, these are, the example you see here has to do with livelihoods in Ethiopia, pastoral livelihoods, but the idea is to try to provide sort of a guided pathway through the data, how you might overlay this information and analyze it in order to reach an insight around resilience. I just want to come back to briefly a point I mentioned at the beginning. I think a key challenge when you're working particularly with global data sets or data sets that are produced by large institutions is trying to make them relevant at national and subnational scales. So that's something we've increasingly been focusing on with Resilience Atlas. What you see here is some other focused work we've done for regional planning in East Africa. This is a slide related to our vital signs program, which is active in a number of countries doing data collection and integration. But basically, we've seen a lot of value in connecting this global data to then locally available information as well. So really users can draw on the best available information from both contexts. So one example from that is work as well is the work we've done on a project we released recently called Trends.Earth. So this is a tool that builds on some of the computing framework of the Resilience Atlas to provide a tool related to planning to achieve land degradation neutrality, which is one of the SDG targets. So what we've done here is, as you can see, there's this global scale data visible in the background at the same time. We have then this other interface users can use within their country that lets them combine, for example, national level land cover or soil carbon data with then globally available information to then provide sort of this hybrid map, giving them information within their country. Before I step down, I did just want to mention a couple things I'm sure will come up from other speakers as well. I think the reason that we're able to get to this point now and have these types of tools is really the enabling environment that we have now from open technology and also cloud computing. We make heavy use of Amazon Web Services, which is a cloud computing platform, and the tool that I just showed you here. So this lets us really have access to essentially limitless computing power, which really lets us do things to integrate and combine data in ways that were never possible before. And then also I think another key driving factor that came out very well in Tyler's presentation is open data. So of course, if this data is siloed and is not available to be used because it's proprietary or have license restrictions on it, makes this type of integration much more difficult. So certainly open technologies like Mapbox, CartoDB, and also open data sets are really key, I think, to move forward in this arena. So, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So we've had data sets from 58 pristine lakes in the Boreal Shield to neighborhoods in Dar es Salaam to understand flood risks. And now we're talking about aggregating global data sets to inform sort of national planning processes, for example. And our next speaker, I believe, is going to take us to an example in Latin America. So we've got Brian King with us, who serves as the coordinator for the CGIAR's platform for big data in agriculture, which is a program to promote catalytic and responsible use of data for agriculture development. Prior to that, he served as Senior Technical Advisor of Digital Development for Feed the Future, an initiative to promote the use of the array of digital technologies for food security in developing economies. And so I'll hand it over to you, Brian. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to IISD and to the Wilson Center for having me. So as Anne mentioned, I coordinate a program called the Platform for Big Data in Agriculture. And CGIAR, if you don't know it, is a network, a global network of nonprofit research centers that have been working for decades around various types of food security and agricultural development research. We've got 15 centers distributed globally. We preserve and regenerate some 750,000 varieties of various food crops in 11 gene banks around the world. And in the last, I'd say, 15 or 20 years, it's become more and more apparent that ways that we, as a research community, interact with market systems and food systems and helping build sustainable food systems is the way that our research needs to the impact pathways for our research will be further developed. And so it's actually my great honor to present a case from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, because it was a source of kind of my own inspiration for going to take on this role. So with this particular case, here's the scenario. The Rice Growers Federation of Colombia has about 70,000 members. Were facing declining rice yields and did not have a precise idea for why that might be. If I remember correctly, it was about almost 10% yield decrease over a few years. And so they reached out to International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, for some help to try to identify what might be driving that. And so they were able to provide data to enable analysis of some 40,000 crop events over multiple years. And CIAT pulled as well the meteorological data. They had some soils data. They had several different aspects of management by variety and so forth. And they applied a kind of combination of traditional statistical analysis, but also so-called big data methodologies, where you can use machine learning to cluster, you can machine learning to tease out relationships that you might not have noticed otherwise, and you can do some methodologies that seem to imply causal relationships. And the really exciting thing that resulted from this hybrid or new and hybrid approach to analysis was that there was one factor that had been not adequately weighted or understood as seeming to have more importance for this yield problem, and that was higher nighttime temperatures. And so this was then, informed guidance for that season that the Rice Growers Federation was able to take up. And it was basically, depending on where your farm was, changing the time that you planted or planting another readily available variety that was more resistant to that particular type of stress. And so this recommendation was, had a tons per hectare impact. The validity of that relatively straightforward recommendation in terms of implementing it was massive. And it's just a great example of how these new approaches can be very complementary and reveal new things beyond what smart people in a room trying to figure something out might be able to achieve. And so so we talk about, just very briefly about challenges, enablers, and lessons learned. I think that the initial challenge was getting the level of trust established where the Rice Growers Federation felt comfortable actually sharing the data. And it was, in fact, in a moment of great concern for them. And then I think that the next challenge is that specifically like the methodologies and the approaches for the research itself, we need to continue to be able to build up the evidence base. And so the researchers themselves, I think, would have preferred to test out those recommendations for a couple of more seasons. However, the Rice Growers Federation sort of needed something right now. And in fact, they went forth and they just implemented based on these recommendations because they were sort of arrived at kind of their wits' end, in my understanding. And so I think that those are the challenges. You'll see that I've actually repeated the same challenges as enablers because I think that we're going to find in multiple of these kind of projects, there's an initial kind of hump to get over. Like if you build enough trust and unlock enough data to deliver some interesting results, you both know more about how to do that research and you build the trust with those folks that you're working with to kind of unlock more data and hopefully unlock more results going into the future. And so then lastly, in terms of the lessons learned, and these are a bit more my own observations from the perspective of the program that I coordinate, where we look at what can we abstract up and what can we define as references in terms of the architectures and the kind of delivery mechanisms and interactivity around these research successes that are happening at CIAD and also at several of the other CGIAR centers. Researchers, by and large, should not be asked to figure out scalable IT architectures. They have enough problems on their plate of actually giving us new insights about the world. So this kind of data architecture expertise is something that we think we need to bring into the conversation. And then researchers, we shouldn't be asking them to be, product-minded people either. There are people that specialize in building good interactive exchange with the whole gamut of customer profiles and users, and so we need those people to be part of this conversation as well. And so, I think that the solutions that CIAD has been able to start to pilot are a good start, and that I think to really turn this into the scalable, adaptive, living picture of the world that we need to be fostering resilience and driving adaptation, I think that these lessons learned are pieces of how that will come together. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. And so our last story is going to come from Mercy Corps, an experience that Mercy Corps is going to share with us. So we've got David Nicholson, who is the Senior Director of Mercy Corps' Technical Unit for Environment, Energy, and Climate Change. And he's also a co-lead for Mercy Corps' Global Resilience Initiative. His work is focused on promoting the integration of climate and ecological systems into Mercy Corps programming, as well as pioneering efforts for accelerating market-based clean energy solutions within Mercy Corps' program footprint. So with that, I'll hand over for our last story from the Big Data for Resilience Storybook.
Great, thank you very much. I have to admit, I was a little nervous when I saw I was going to be the 6th speaker of 6 at an event talking about big data right before lunch. But I think it's testament to very sort of clear and concise and interesting presentations from my colleagues here, and as well as the sort of storybook approach that Angelica and her colleagues have taken that I think is really important for this topic because it really puts a lot of texture on what we're talking about. So I think Mercy Corps, for those who don't know, we're a development and a humanitarian and development group, and I think we sort of represent some of the frontline efforts of how to get from big data to the hands of the most vulnerable around the world. We've been thinking about resilience a lot over the last 4 or 5 years, and I think that's really forced us to start thinking about the work that we do on larger scales, start thinking about and trying to better understand different trends and different forces that are operating on the communities that we work within, and trying to figure out, well, how do we use this information to better inform our programs and our strategies to ultimately build resilience? And that's really forced us to engage in this topic in a very real way. We've realized that access to timely and, as one of my colleagues said, relevant information at the right scale is really a fundamental resilience capacity. And we've got a range of experiments around the world that have been trying to figure out, how do we act as a facilitator for that information? How do we ensure this information gets to the right people at the right time in such a way that can build resilience? And we have a range of experiments around the world that have been trying to do that. And I'm just going to share a quick story from our team in Mongolia, who have been looking at the resilience of pastoralists and herder families in Mongolia. This work is absolutely been driven by the guys in Mongolia. It's really, really fascinating, and just consider me a representative of their work. And I actually know some of them watching, so I'll apologize in advance if I butcher any of the work you guys have been doing. I don't know if anyone's been to Mongolia. It's a pretty beautiful place, and even those that haven't have probably seen sort of iconic photos of huge, expansive grasslands and rolling forests and all this wonderful, wonderful picturesque landscape. It also, within all that beauty, it holds a really key and pretty abundant natural resource base that sort of is fundamental to the livelihoods of what is a very, very sparse population over a huge area. And their livelihoods really depend on this natural resource base. Livestock production is the driver of livelihoods across the expanses of Mongolia. There's about 300,000 families that are entirely dependent on that resource base to raise cows, raise sheep, over what's a pretty challenging climate that can change pretty dramatically over a pretty short period of time. This livestock is fundamental to food, to water, to transportation, to any kind of market activity, economic activity that's people are able to engage in. The woman you see on the left here, her name is Alten Naran, and along with her family here, this represents pretty seasoned herders in the Mongolian context. Like many herders in Mongolia, they have a really deep sense of place. They're very, very connected to the land that they live in. And they've developed a whole range of different sorts of techniques on how to manage risk and thrive in a pretty harsh environment. And for generations and generations, these really have been the picture of resilience. When we think about resilience, these are the kinds of families that really demonstrate what it means to be resilient. However, in 2009, they actually lost more than half of their herd. and it forced them to quit the rural livelihood and have to move to the rapidly growing urban areas. And this family, they're not outliers in the context of Mongolia. In the past 20 years, there's been pretty dramatic changes in the environment. There's a word in Mongolian called a zud, for those unfamiliar. And it's a unique word that basically references the slow onset disaster situation that starts with a hot, dry summer and then leads to a very, very harsh winter. And the combination of those two things is devastating to the main livelihoods group. And these zud events have been getting significantly worse over the last 20 years. They tend to be preceded by droughts and then go into those harsh winters from the photo you just saw. And we've seen far-reaching consequences of that. Since 2000, there's been 20 million cattle lost in events like this, which is a dramatic when we're talking about 300,000 households in total across a huge area of land. So there's been coping mechanisms that households have been deploying, minimizing food intake, trying to maintain winter stores. But when all that fails, people are forced to move into the cities. In searching for employment in what's perceived to be a booming opportunity, but doesn't always turn out to be that way. As recently as 2015, despite access to mobile technology, there was really no good information services for these herder families. National news, national weather forecasts were available, and people could engage with those, but they weren't providing the sort of hyper-local information that people need to make decisions on things like when to shear sheep, when to go to market, when to harvest hay, these fundamental decisions that really are critical to the livelihood. But the mobile phone coverage presented an opportunity, and we've seen this in many parts of the world, that a fast and efficient way to get information to people can be harnessed in lots and lots of different ways. So in 2016, Mercy Corps worked with USAID and OFDA to develop an SMM platform called the Advanced Weather Information Service. The name translates to GET in Mongolian. And it's a demand-driven system that enables people to pull down localized weather and climate information in real time. Takes 2 to 5 seconds to receive a response to queries, and it has really enabled people to access the kind of information that we think is fundamental. It uses a variety of different sources of big data, the things we're talking about today, things like darksky.net, which I think many people are probably familiar with. There is an early warning system in Mongolia for disaster management that Mercy Corps has been working with the government on, pulls data into that as well, and other sorts of emergency warning information. This has enabled decision-making that's pretty essential for resilience. The operating theory of our team going into it based on our research was that this would help sort of coping and adaptive capacities that are really, really important. People are able to make risk-informed decisions in a real-time basis. But we also thought it could help sort of transformative capacities. It can help the enabling environment, sort of emergency response systems from government and from elsewhere can actually understand what's happening in different parts of the country in a real-time basis, can help for planning, for recovery, all these things that we know are really, really important in a changing risk environment such as Mongolia. And it does appear that the users think it's worth it. We did an impact assessment for the initial first couple of years of the program in 2017, and we saw that 34% of users have used it more than 3 times. We've had 8% using it 10 times or more in that year. And people do pay a small fee for this, so it's very, very difficult to have fee-paying services for access to information. So we've sort of we've indicated strongly that this is highly valuable to teams that are using it. Given this success, our team's been since working really hard to think about, all right, what do we do with this now? Because Mercy Corps in the long run is not an organization that wants to be a data provider in any sense. So we've actually been working closely with the government, who will take ownership of this system in 2018. The National Emergency Management Agency is the specific group, and we've been working with them on sort of technical and capacity building to ensure that they're able to manage and continue to enhance the service. We've also been working with them to improve there's more and more data sets available, and we're working with them to improve the data that's coming through the system. And most importantly, we've been working with different entities within countries to ensure that data is actually acted upon. And one of my colleagues said this already today, like, the information is a great thing, but we need to make sure the systems are in place for people to be able to make decisions, respond to the information in a way that enables them to enhance their livelihoods. So we want to go back to our family that we started with Altan. This photo was taken last year, 2017. They've returned to livestock production, and they're engaging pretty regularly in this system, and it has enabled them to feel more confident. the perception of being able to manage a different set of risks is really, really important, and we've seen a very positive impact of that. So this is just one of several stories that we've seen of trying to figure out how do you get this information into the hands of decision makers in a sustainable way. Groups like Mercy Corps have been grappling and working with the expertise of many others that you've seen here to figure out, one, how can we use it to improve our own decision making? And then more importantly, how do we advance that capacity to key decision makers, whether it's households, whether it's local governments, to enable to support resilience building efforts. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. If I could just actually invite our speakers to now sit up on the panel, and we've got time, which is great. We've got about 35 minutes to have a bit of a discussion and hear any questions or reflections or inputs from the audience as well on this issue of big data for resilience. I think what was really fascinating is that we've seen from these various stories what we mean by big data. It could be 50 years of freshwater science from a particular part of Canada. It could be looking at 40,000 rice cropping events, for example, to help inform, to help problem solve a particular industry or sector in Colombia. It could be looking at, filling in maps so that we can have more disaster-informed planning in a particular community. And then we've got here using global data sets as well for very specific livelihoods, for national planning processes. So we've seen these sort of directions of influence going up and down from scale and different types of data sets being used for all of this. So I think we're seeing sort of the richness and the potential of how big data can actually be used to build resilience. So with this, I'm going to open it up to all of you, to any questions or concerns that you might have about this topic. And what we'll do is we'll take about 2 or 3 questions at a time. And please introduce yourself and state your affiliation and direct your question as you would like. So we've got, and speak directly into the microphone so the people on the webcast can hear. So we've got 2 people here with mics. So we've got, take the gentleman there in the gray shirt first, and then this gentleman.
Hi, I'm TJ May. I'm an Air Force fellow. I'm curious, for those of you that kind of crowdsource your data collection, if you had any concerns about accuracy or the quality of the data that you're receiving and how you kind of mitigated any potential errors or at least accounted for that in your analyses.
Okay, that's the first question. The gentleman.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. There was kind of an underlying theme in your presentations, which is how to connect data to policy or policymakers and decision makers. So I'm wondering about where we are in terms of mapping decision nodes, institutions that make decisions, industry, R&D centers, projects, and how they impact the quality of water, let's say, for example. So I'm just wondering about the institutional and policy side here, how to map that and how to encourage more holistic problem solving on the part of institutions around these kinds of problems.
Okay. And maybe we could take a third question. I think the lady in the back there. If you could just, yep.
Hi, I'm Audrey Anderson with Mercy Corps. Thank you all so much for your very interesting presentations of where this journey has really taken you so far. And I'd be interested in hearing from you, what do you see on the horizon? What's coming up? As many of you have mentioned, this field is rapidly changing right now. And I'm curious what is exciting for you right now on the horizon of where big data can take us for strengthening resilience? Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, maybe we'll just start with those 3 questions. And so from what I heard, we have a question around accuracy, the role of institutions, mapping sort of the decision nodes, as you put it, and then what's coming up next. So who'd like to tackle some of those questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start on the crowdsourcing question. So thanks very much for the question. Who remembers using Wikipedia 10, 15 years ago? I think, during the early days, there was a lot of skepticism. Like, are these articles actually accurate? Am I getting correct information? And now it's gotten to a point where it's almost a given, right? It's actually become an authoritative source and very well documented for most articles. So the work that we do around crowdsourcing map data has a lot of similarities in that we work with this big global community. So I gave the example of Tanzania. We have roughly 1 million people around the world who've contributed to OpenStreetMap. So in terms of data quality, yes, there very much are errors. But what we see is over time, volunteers have a natural inclination to actually correct those errors and make the data better and better. So it's a continuously evolving project. Map data is better in some places than others, but over time, we've gotten to the point where OpenStreetMap has now become the authoritative map source for many humanitarian organizations and many development projects around the world in places where some of the commercial map providers just don't have the same incentives to work there. Thanks.
I wanted to speak to the data quality issue as well. Actually, the crowdsourcing question is an interesting one. There are 3 cases that come to mind right now just within the CGIAR network where they've done the work to go and compare self-reported yields, crop yields to crop cut yields, and found actually they're close enough to that they feel comfortable integrating those into different kinds of analyses. You would probably want to keep testing kind of by crop and context and so forth to be able to continue to do that. But they sort of did the work and demonstrated in 3 separate places in the world, thinking across those studies, that we need to be using that as a data stream and continually sort of checking it, but we need to be integrating it more into the kinds of analyses we do. And then in terms of also to speak to data quality across all of these presentations and any number of other conversations going on around the world, you will eventually end up looking back at ontologies and how do you actually organize and structure information. And so in the context of more focused, it's most advanced with crop research. So FAO has a continually evolving standard set of vocabularies that you can use for describing different things that you're researching related to crop productivity. And similarly, there's similar work ongoing about how do you actually structure knowledge in a way that can start to build more interoperability between different types of data. And so it's a constraint we're all kind of bumping up against in terms of that back-end guiding logic that will then enable other people to interoperate with and use your data. And it's directly related to that quality question as well.
Great. Yeah, please, David.
I want to respond to the data to policy question, and I think it's a really important one. One thing that Mercy Corps has learned in various places of sort of grappling with how to bring this data into decision making at different levels is, it's sort of obvious to say, but it's incredibly context specific, and the need is to map sort of official and, more importantly, the unofficial decision making nodes in different places that we work. We're seeing a trend of devolution of decision making in various places we work, and I think Kenya's a really good example that when that devolution actually occurs in a robust way, you can start to identify the sub-national decision makers, which seem to be the place we get the most traction in getting to a policy that actually does impact people on the ground. But that mapping process in a specific place using sort of local knowledge has been fundamental for us.
And what about this? The third question we had about, maybe it's a bit premature to ask this when we still have a bit of time left for discussion, but what's next? You've had some, I don't know how preliminary these examples are in terms of your own organizations of using big data and applying it for various sort of projects or initiatives or programming. But has it sort of opened up a new world of possibility for you and sort of new directions within your own organizations? Are there sort of incubating ideas of where you might want to take this?
Perhaps I can start just because I had the great pleasure and opportunity of working with all these teams simultaneously, and it was an interesting place to be because I was able to kind of draw some preliminary comparisons and see how the different organizations have similarities but also differences in terms of big data. And some of the emerging themes across the 8 experiences that are included in the storybooks are actually quite interesting. I think that, as somebody mentioned before, the issue of cross-scale dynamics was common to all the cases, and how do we really make sense and articulate and make the most of large-scale data for the benefit and the achievement of development outcomes of individuals at the end of the day, right? So how really do we articulate all these benefits and potentials? But at the same time, something that came across very clearly is that all the organizations are very aware also of the risks that are involved in working with large volumes of data and data sets, not only in terms of ensuring the veracity and the quality of the data, but also in terms of ensuring privacy, security, and ethical management of the information. And I think all the organizations working with us in the storybook was something that they brought up, and they all approach it in different ways. So one of the advantages in going forward, going back to Audrey's question, is how do we really continue to foster these kinds of dialogues and these types of collaborations for organizations to actually share their approaches to data management, share their approaches to security and to privacy, and strengthen that together. The last point that I want to mention, and I know that this is very close to Audrey's heart and the work that Mercy Corps is doing in terms of resilience, is how do we get better and learn more about issues of power and equity in regards to a role of big data for resilience building. So how are these different initiatives integrating women, men, boys and girls, seniors and people with disability as part of their projects, and ensure that those individuals also benefit from the potential of big data. Issues of monitoring and evaluation and learning from big data was also a topic that emerged directly or indirectly from all the cases. So I think that there's much more that we need to do in terms of how do we really measure and learn from the impact of big data. And the last point, I promise, is something that one of you mentioned, and is the importance of being very flexible, and at the end of the day, adopting perhaps a hybrid approach to big data, and try to mix it with local level participatory methods, and ensuring that there's that integration and the value of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge that also plays a very important part in resilience building. So all big data starts with small data, and small data is individual data. Thank you.
Right. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that. I certainly agree. I think if we come back to the 4 aspects of big data that we mentioned earlier, I think if you talk about volume and velocity, I think we're close to getting there in terms of addressing that challenge, in part because a lot of the solutions are primarily technical. Basically, we can throw more computing power at it, we can throw more storage at it, and those I think are a bit easier to resolve. We've spoken to veracity and data quality a bit earlier. I think variety is a big challenge. And really, I think we're getting to the point where we can build systems to integrate a diverse range of information. But once we've done that, what do we do with it? And I think Brian mentioned a bit about some of the work with machine learning. And I think there's a lot of potential there for machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us try and actually draw insights out of these large databases. So once that integration is done, what do we do with it? And then I think at the same time, remembering a lot of the points you made about the fact that it's not just the big data, we really need to be able to take account of local knowledge as well. So I see those as two challenges, but I think there definitely are opportunities on the horizon.
Great. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask, or any sort of input at this? Yes, gentleman in the back there.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andre Mershon from USAID Center for Resilience. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I want to be a little honest. When I first saw the topic for this panel, my gut reaction was, well, we work in a lot of places that are pretty data sparse, and how would big data actually apply to some of those places? I'm talking about some of the very remote places that we work in northern Kenya or southern Ethiopia or in the Sahel. And so one of the questions I have for you guys is, when you think about big data in the way that we would traditionally think of it in developed countries, where you're mining information from, say, social media or credit scores or other things that we think of where we would get big data from, a lot of the areas that we work in, that data isn't as available. And I think the humanitarian OpenStreetMap was a nice example of how we would get that data. And we do spend a lot of money collecting data on these areas. But I'm wondering if there are other examples of data, big data, that might be out there that we're not thinking of perhaps from mobile network operators, banks, et cetera, that we may not be thinking of that could be helpful in informing our analysis and understanding of these locations and how people kind of operate and work within these locations relevant to resilience.
Great question. Thank you. Was there any other question? I saw another hand. Yes, the gentleman down here in the.
Hi there, I'm Daniel Berger from Creative Associates International. My question is basically more of a data question, a big data question in particular, but a lot of the outputs of our data models end up being probabilities, and humans are terrible at interpreting probabilities, so I'm curious what things you guys have done to help, especially when there's individual end users, use probability outputs in a way that actually helps them.
That's an interesting question.
Great, thank you. Another question, or are we good? Okay, so maybe I'll, with these. Any reactions to this question of looking at other examples of big data, particularly in data sparse environments? Seems to be very relevant, yeah.
I think there's a growing body of evidence that is very encouraging about using mobile network metadata, for example, to establish proxies for things that we're interested in getting a kind of greater temporal resolution, more frequency of observation about how certain things are evolving. I can think of a couple of papers that specifically trace movement through value chains, for example, of commodities, or proxies for different demographic features or gender, that you can establish pretty strong proxies in mobile network metadata. And obviously not absolutely everybody's connected, but many people are. And so a combination of, I kind of have one main mental model for this stuff, which is we work from the small data, as Angelica talked about. We work from the data that we have a pretty good idea what we think it tells us about the world, and then we use that to establish the framework for trying to establish the proxies in the large, messy, sort of other types of data. And then we can, along the way, do spot measures to help see if our predictions are on track. And I think that's true for ground data that you can then use to interpret and train up satellite imagery. I think that's true for establishing proxies in mobile network metadata. And there are 5 or 6 other ones, I'm sure, that if I sat and thought about them, I could rattle them off right now. But, I do think that there's, from the ag development research perspective, there are sort of non-traditional data sets that we're kind of accelerating our adoption and use of.
David.
Yeah, on this question of data sparse environments, it's something we think a lot about. And the first thing I would say is, that the number of data sparse places is shrinking. And there's, we're seeing a lot more data available in places where before there was nothing. The bigger challenge is often being able to access that data. Some of it is often locked up in various government ministries that don't talk to each other, or it's not well maintained and well cleaned. There is MNO data or social media data that it can't always be accessed. But it does tend to exist. And something that we often come back to with our teams when we're thinking about this is the vast improvements that can be made in sort of decision making, whether it's policy or whether it's work of NGOs and UN, is just accessing simple data sets. You get a vast improvement. And oftentimes we're operating in places where we're using zero data. So frankly, the little that exists, if it's actually properly used, it can really, really have a dramatic impact. And then we can, once you do that, you can start thinking about the sort of newer forms of data that can improve that. But I think access to the minimum data that does exist is the place to start.
And one of the original big data areas is remote sensing from satellites, and it still doesn't feel like we're using that to its full capabilities. It still feels, I don't know how you guys feel, but like it's still a research area that occasionally makes its way into actual utility and use, like in humanitarian OpenStreetMap. So there's probably a lot of opportunity there still to leverage more data, and with machine learning and whatnot like that, we can probably do a lot more at a community scale and not at a national or global scale.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point, because certainly a lot of the areas that we work, we face the same challenge. There's very limited traditional data in terms of structured surveys, and your last census may have been 30 years prior. There may be questions about that data, but you can get a lot of contextual information from remote sensing, which combined with surveys from other areas. If you look at projects like the World Pop project, Initially, they started mapping population density. Now they actually go down to age structure and a lot more demographic information. So I think there is a lot that context from remote sensing and other data sets, when combined with other information, can help you to fill in some of those blank spaces on the map.
One of the other things that I won't repeat my example about crowdsourcing maps because we already talked about that, but I will mention that there are some other things I didn't show, and I agree, David, with your comments that oftentimes there are data sets. What our organization does is help to sort of make them openly available or get them into a more public, in a format that's more actually usable. So, and then one of the other things we're doing is sort of democratizing aerial imagery. So in the past, you had to be a big space agency to launch a satellite. Now, anyone can buy a drone for less than $1,000 and sometimes just a couple $100. So one of the other things we're working with communities to do is actually provide training on how to use drones to collect just really super detailed and high resolution aerial imagery over the places they live, and that can be used for a whole host of purposes, creating better maps, but also across the sectors from agriculture to water and sanitation, et cetera. So I think that the key is, and going back to the kind of question of what's next in the future, is making these technologies more easily accessible to people everywhere, kind of lowering the barriers to entry, both in terms of cost and complexity.
I want to come to this question of probabilities and using information and applying, I guess, probabilistic outputs from applying big data. And maybe I'll start with you, Brian, because I think we mentioned in the case of the Farmers Association, it worked out. You probably didn't have the time that you would have liked to sort of validate what the recommendations that you were making, because they wanted to move. And in this case, it went really well. And I think there was a probability aspect in all of this as well. And there's a chance that it could have not gone well. And so any reflections on probabilities and, especially when it affects livelihoods?
I think that there's tons, as I forgot your name, sorry. In terms of the questioner, when he talked about model outputs being, probabilities, I think that models obviously are being used at different scales, and right now, they inform coarser level decision making, and it's a bit more fraught. It's a bit more complicated when we want to get to finer level decision making. And I think part of it is the data quality question, like improving the quality of the data. A lot of the inputs that go in sort of national scale modeling, for example, work from pretty coarse public satellite information that may or may not be, and there may or may not be sufficient ground truth information to really inform those models so that you're getting the best possible quality output from that model. And so I think it's directly linked to the data quality question, but there was also a kind of user dimension to the question of like, okay, well, if you're saying like you have a 30% chance of not being in trouble, like, how useful is that for a user? And I think that's just, it comes down to context and come down to human decision makers at that point. But we have a lot of work to do to improve the quality that goes into those.
I've been wondering if meteorology is a model for this, because when you look at the weather system around the world, we already have a globally linked network of big data collection happening. We already have that feeding into models, creating probabilistic outputs. And we already have people looking at AccuWeather and saying, why is my 36-day outlook totally wrong? So there is a model for something that's already built there, integrating big data, but there's also an understanding of how people interpret or misinterpret that data as well. May misunderstand if it's not presented in a correct way.
And actually, thank you so much. Is it David, right? Daniel, for your question, because actually this also came up from the analysis of the cases, and is that in one of the cases, actually, one of the recommendations was precisely how do we understand better and respond to trade-offs. So we need data in order to respond to the impacts of shocks in the short term in order to take decisions and potentially save save lives, but what are the trade-offs in terms of the level of certainty or uncertainty of the data and the veracity? So there's certainly an opportunity cost there. And one of the recommendations was precisely going back to a question of what's next, developing more practitioner-oriented guidelines on how to use the data and how to not only use it, but first of all, understand it and then apply it to a local context. So what we are seeing is kind of an emerging demand as big data becomes more popular and more well-known. Demand from practitioners in the field to understand it better and to have kind of clear guidelines on how to use it.
Great. Do we have any other questions at this point from the audience? Any reflections? Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Ralph Aubrey. One of the early attempts at this was GEOS and weather, and I remember that they had very, very significant battles on what an average person would think is a simple data element such as temperature. The panel here, we have a number of different disciplines looking at different types of data, some fuzzy, some precise. Have you already undergone those data element battles, or are you just trying to get some of the basic elements started before you go there?
Okay. Before we answer that, is there any other question that we can take at this point? Yeah, we have one more.
I'm just curious if some of you could kind of touch on how you might go about kind of increasing education from a consumer standpoint on how you go from I have a question that I think big data can answer to, this really pretty output that is really usable. What happens kind of, more in between there? If you could just share some of the resources for education in that area.
Great. One more I think this is going to be our last round of questions. So if anybody's got any burning questions or comments at this point. Okay, so, sorry, one more.
Yeah, I had one, and we touched on it a little bit. I think we all generally agree that data is kind of an unmitigated good thing, and having more data and having more people with access to that data is a good thing. I'm just wondering if there are any potential negative effects, and we talked a little bit about privacy and some of those issues. I wonder if you guys could comment a little bit more on perhaps some negative or some unintended consequences of having more data and more access to that data out there.
Great question. Very timely. Great. Okay, so I'll open it up to our panelists to address those questions and also maybe have any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up. Anybody want to tackle these questions on increasing education in big data, the negative unintended effects of using, accessing, applying big data? Yeah. Yep.
Sure. I'll start with a couple ideas. So on education, I can only kind of speak to our example, but one of the things that we're thinking about is how do we basically get young people started earlier on becoming more aware of the world around them through data. And one of the initiatives actually that's partially supported from USAID GeoCenter is called Youth Mappers, which is really all about getting young people interested in geography and interested in learning about other countries outside of the US by mapping their world and doing it using satellite imagery and other types of big data. So I think that's a really interesting example. In terms of, I'll just touch on the question about are there potential negatives? Yes, I mean, I think we've all seen that recently in terms of the data privacy discussions and scandals that have come up in the past few weeks. In terms of map data, we're often working with community members who are putting their individual house onto the world map and making that data openly available to the world for the first time. That can be really powerful for somebody to see their home on the map and realize that somebody cares enough that my home in this small village is now on the world map. It could, in some cases, it can also be really dangerous. If you look at areas that are affected by conflict, identifying, even though we don't identify who lives in the home, we're identifying infrastructure. In some cases, there can be things that are derived from that information, like maybe what type of, for example, if you're working in an informal settlement or a slum that hasn't been on the map, putting that area on the map could could disrupt entrenched power interests in the area, or it could actually lead to government taking adverse action against that community. So that's just one example. There's a lot of other examples as well if you're looking at areas affected by conflict or areas that have, for example, corporate mining interests, right? So in terms of land use and land tenure. So I could probably go on and on with that, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else want to jump in and share any final thoughts at this point?
I think we are in the role of being stewards of sometimes sensitive data and data that might turn out to be sensitive in ways we couldn't anticipate. And so and then the frameworks for ethics and responsibility are not evolving as quickly as the technologies themselves. The USAID actually open data policy has some very interesting provisions about averting, to the best of your ability, creating a mosaic type effect where even if you have anonymized data, you have enough points that can be assembled that you can then go and identify the individuals. I think that's as good a policy as I've seen so far in terms of being sensitive to the privacy question. I'm not saying that it's going to solve every problem everywhere. At the same time, we have this need, I think genuinely, to unlock the full value of very granular, very detailed data sets because it reveals important things about the world to us. And so, I'm kind of looking for models within the health sector where, you can have HIPAA for soils or HIPAA for, farm data or those kinds of things where, the methodologies for protecting privacy while still in an encrypted environment actually getting integration of those very granular data sets and producing products that then can be public products. And I think it's a under-addressed need, at least in the agricultural development space.
I think that with great information and great data comes great responsibility as well. And I think that one of the more evident risks as well in terms of big data is the creation of these balances of power. So we just need to make sure that the data is accessible and is usable for those that need it the most. So not try to avoid that the data and the knowledge that data leads to resides into kind of the same circle. So that goes again to the importance of inclusion and transparency in processes that use big data to build resilience. I think that the last point, and it's interesting for me, is kind of cycling back to when this initiative was first designed at ISD, is the question of, does big data lead intrinsically and automatically to better, bigger resilience? And the answer is no. We need to be very careful. We need to have a kind of a critical look to really what is the role of big data. Think again about issues of access, assessment, application into decision making, and actionability. So how does that big data really translates into development outcomes? And ask the tough questions. Big data for what? What purpose? Where? Of whose? How are we going to collect it and ensure that it's used properly? And my favorite question of all, now what? What is that we're going to do with the data that we're collecting and with the lessons that we're learning? Thanks.
Great. David.
Thanks. I think the question on education links directly to the question on potential sort of negative outcomes of this data. From our perspective, the reality is that we're dealing with either our own staff members, our local partners, local government entities, and communities. We're often dealing with pretty low education users. And there's still a really wide gap between even the best efforts to translate information to a usable platform or usable structure. It's a pretty wide gap between that and the reality that we're dealing with. And I think there's no shortcuts there. I mean, I think it's the hard yards of rolling up our sleeves and learning ourselves and then walking through our partners to be able to use this effectively. And there are efforts out there. USAID's Surveyor platform has done a good job in different regions of trying to provide capacity building services for organizations. Still a long way to go to get into the hands of the people that truly are making decisions on a day-to-day basis. But I think that's a good example of that. But I think that we have to be a little cautious and realize that access to this information without a really true understanding of it can be dangerous, and that gets to the potential negativity here. Because I've already seen it within our own organization and within partners that it can lead to overconfidence in making decisions that may be based on misinterpreting data or not understanding probability, which I think is really important. People don't all people have a hard time understanding probability. We've all been out and seen, there's only a 20% chance of rain today, and then complained when it rained, right? It's we don't understand that these can happen, and that we see that playing out a lot, and we do get a little bit concerned. With a lot of the users, ultimate users that Mercy Corps is concerned with, there's a huge risk in asking people to make a livelihood decision based on a set of data. We're making recommendations for people in Ethiopia to sell their cattle because we think there's a really serious drought coming. You only get one shot at that. Yeah. Because if those people sell their cattle and the drought doesn't materialize, and their neighbors and family members elsewhere, have really healthy cattle at the end of the season, they're not going to trust that data again. So we have to be really, really cautious in what we're doing. And we see that play out in many, many areas. That first impression really, really counts. But I want to, just as a closing remark, I want to end up on a positive, because despite that challenge, we do think there's really, really huge opportunity here for the work that sort of humanitarian and development organizations do, and we're really just scratching the surface. There's a lot we can be doing at even pretty basic level of data sets, as I said, and as the field advances into more and more sophisticated data, I think it's incumbent on us to work with the experts to figure out, continually ask ourselves, how do we apply this to different sectors and different elements of our work. I would love to see Mercy Corps country programs all have a little hive of data analyst people being able to keep up to date. And the reality is our business model doesn't support that. So it's incumbent on us to build the right partnerships with people who do this for a living constantly to help us make decisions in our programs. And I think we're starting to do that well, and there's lots more opportunity for that.
Great, thanks. Alex, did you want to sort of share any closing remarks before?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think as has been mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities here. And then also, of course, there are the challenges that come up with the responsibilities that we have with big data. And I think echoing, what Angelica mentioned earlier, one challenge that I see that we do need to address is making sure that Indigenous peoples, local communities, concerns are addressed. And particularly when we start talking about big data, that can be a key concern in terms of, even if you have disconnected data sets that on their own don't pose a risk, once you combine them together, there certainly can be a risk. If you start talking about mapping resources where land tenure may not be secure, there can be a lot of concerns that come up with that. So I think that's one area that we definitely need to look at. It can be addressed to some extent by making sure that local communities are involved in our projects and doing things in a participatory way. And again, just coming back to the fact that there's a lot of opportunity on the horizon. We're now getting at the point where I think we've addressed many of the key technical challenges we had to begin with big data. And I think at this point it's moving forward, trying to understand, now that we have all this data together, what are all the amazing things that we can do with it.
Great, thanks. And Jeff, is there anything you wanted to share from the...
It was interesting throughout this, in that really geography is still our problem and opportunity, in that most of this data is geographic and spatial as we're looking at the world, smaller and smaller scales. So it's problems we haven't solved in the past century of, formal geography as a discipline, and something it looks like we're still going to be working with in the next century or more, hopefully. The second thing is that you read a lot of the press about big data, and they talk about AI, and that's, your pathway is IoT collects the data, big data is your storage and management, and AI will solve it and spit out how you figure out your problems. But we're seeing here it's not even that complex, and a lot of times it's not as meaningful as, I come back to the Resilience Atlas and how a simple overlay can tell you so much of two different maps. And that's kind of where I'm seeing this go, just putting the data out there for people to manipulate in a way that makes sense. So it's an interesting area, and I'm very, very thankful to gain all this information from this group.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we're out of time. So I want to thank our panelists and the presentations and sharing their stories that are going to be, are available now in the Big Data for Resilience Storybook. It's available online. So if you go to the ISD website at isd.org, it's available on the Resilience program webpage. I think we've got some copies of this flyer out there that have more information on that. And so with that, I want to thank David, Brian, Alex, Tyler, Jeff, and of course Angelica for joining us, and all of you who were with us this morning with sharing your own questions and reflections on this, and those who've joined us online as well, and our friends at the Wilson Center. So thanks very much, and have a good weekend.